Hello and welcome back to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, we're breaking down the year in the comic book industry in two parts. In part one, we'll look at the state of the comic book industry as a whole, as well as what things were going on in society that may have impacted the comic book industry during that year. We'll talk big picture about what's going on at DC and independent comics, then we'll shift our focus to Marvel. We'll look at who is creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics debuted or ended. In part 2, we'll dive deep into Marvel's longest-running characters, Matt Murdock. We'll look at what the year had in store for the Man Without Fear, key things that happened, and who joined or left his world before spotlighting one key issue or story. From there, we'll wrap up the year's discussion with a takeaway before moving on to another year and a whole new discussion. We're excited to have you join us on a trip through comic book history. We are back for another year. It is 1996. My name is Duane. With me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, you've been alluding to this. Is today the day?
Today is, this is the day we actually get to start seeing what all of these years of abusing the comic book buying populace finally amounts to. So essentially, it is the end of days. Been promising you that things were going to explode eventually, and we've arrived. So welcome to the fateful year 1996, when Marvel came crashing down, in actually more ways than one, but primarily one.
Okay.
So.
That could not be a more ominous introduction to the year. I guess I'm kind of looking forward to this. I can't imagine it was so great during this year, though.
No, it was not. I didn't actually mention bankruptcy yet, so it could have been more ominous. So.
Yes, it could have.
See, now it's more ominous.
Yes,
So
yes, it is. With that, I think we should jump in and let's talk about the year in comics. The year in comics. Okay, Dan, we're starting out outside of the Marvel sphere. Everybody else in the comic book industry. You alluded that it's Marvel comes crashing down. I'm curious, is it just Marvel this year that has a rough time in 1996? Or, because I mean, everybody was doing it. DC was flooding the market with books. You had a lot of independents as well. What broad strokes? What are we talking about when we talk about the comic book industry as a whole in 1996?
So, I mean, as usual, there was a lot of great stuff going on in comics this year. There was still also a lot of junk out there. But 1996 is the year where we sort of start to see that sort itself out. Because what we're going to find is there aren't a lot of new publishers coming in. There really aren't a lot of publishers leaving. And the ones that do leave, for the most part, were struggling anyways because of what's been going on. It is for everybody other than Marvel, it's a disastrous but boring year, if we can put it that way, right?
Yeah.
Sales...
That's not terrible.
Sales continue to not be what they'd like them to be, but nobody else is in the trouble Marvel is. And partly the reason for that is that we're going to see a lot of Marvel's problems are not because of their comic book line.
It's other stuff. Yeah, they've been diversifying the last few years. And you're telling me that didn't go well?
We're going to find that they have all sorts of problems with sticker books and baseball cards and buying their own distribution company and everything that DC does not have to worry about, that some of the other companies don't have to worry about. But they're having their own problems. So DC actually probably of all the companies had the best year. So they had a number of stories that were really well received and are still highly thought of today. They did not come crashing down financially or anything like that, and they actually had some good things going on in other media too. So the big news out of DC for this year, story-wise, is that Lois and Clark got married this year. Both on the TV show and
Right.
also in the comic books.
Oh, okay.
So if you remember, Clark proposed a few years ago and then they put it off and whatever. Well, this year they actually did get married. And partly it was to tie it into the idea that they were getting married in the show, so they wanted to keep things consistent. Partly I think it was just that for a long time a lot of the writers and folks at DC had been thinking that, a 40, 50-year courtship is plenty. Maybe it's time for, you know,
We don't
time for
need to
Clark
keep
to
this.
take the plunge.
We don't need to keep this Sam and Diane thing
Yeah.
going any longer. After 40 years, we can finally let the happy couple be the happy couple.
So yeah, I mean they met in 1937 and it's 1996 now, so that's a 60-year courtship and it was about time. So
That is,
congratulations to the
yeah,
happy couple.
yay.
Outside of that, Kingdom Come by Mark Waid and Alex Ross came out. Very, very well received. It's a fantastic story, essentially, about all of DC's current heroes sort of getting a little older and retiring, and the next generation of heroes coming in and taking their place, most of whom are a bunch of spoiled brats and the like, and then Superman has to come back in and clean things up. And it's a really good story, though. Kingdom Come is a lot of fun. Batman: The Long Halloween by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale comes out. This is one of my favorite Batman stories. It's like every holiday there's a new thing happening that they have to deal with, and it kind of helped to bring back sort of that eerie, sort of spooky kind of Batman to the to DC. Not
Uh-huh.
even so much a a vicious Batman as just somebody who's kind of in this weird space where it's very noirish and sort of gothic. Um, Nightwing got his own book. Uh, Came from Chuck Dixon and Scott McDaniel. Scott McDaniel of Daredevil fame that we've been
Oh, yes.
seeing. And this became very popular. In fact, I would say that the characterization that they put together in this Nightwing book has become sort of the basis for the character ever since. This is really when Robin stopped being Robin and became a different character. When Dick Grayson was able to take on his own personality. We got a new Supergirl book where Supergirl also gets kind of a new origin story and a new chance to do some stuff. And the first Birds of Prey, which Birds of Prey has become one of my favorite series over the last 20 some years from DC. Gail Simone's done some great books with it. There's currently a really good series out that's been getting a lot of accolades. But that's basically Black Canary, Oracle, or Batgirl, depending on the time. Huntress, a lot of the sort of the female martial artsy type heroes of the DC universe get together in a group and go around busting heads and solving crimes. So always like those. We had a big DC crossover called Final Night, which they kind of hid the title there. A Sun Eater, which is a legion, kind of a legion. You don't even call it a villain really. It's more just like a force of nature. It's kind of like a
Okay.
DC Galactus in some ways that was coming along and was going to eat Earth's sun. Eventually, Green Arrow has to come in and stop, or Green Arrow. Eventually, Green Lantern has to come in and stop it, and but that runs through a bunch of books. We had Detective Comics hit issue number 700,
Wow.
which is a big number.
That's a big number. Yeah.
Yep. In the modern world of constant reboots, we may never see another issue 700. That's like a
No.
300 game winner in baseball. You're probably
Yeah.
just never going to see it again. Same thing with an issue 700. They have actually kind of done that with a lot of the Marvel ones, where they restart the numbering just before they get to a big number. But Detective actually got there honestly. There are 700 straight issues of Detective that came out pretty much every month for, 60 years, and that's how they got to 700. It wasn't canceled 17 times or whatever like some of the Marvel and other books are getting to it now. So
Okay.
that was one of the few books, Detective in Action and Adventure, were some of the few books that survived during even the darkest days of the 50s and everything, and have, because of that, a continued numbering all the way from back in the 40s. So, we had a couple things DC did lose this year. Neil Gaiman brought Sandman to an end with issue number 75. Didn't get canceled for sales trouble. It was a very popular book at the time. Could have kept going. But that was the story he'd wanted to tell, and his career as a novelist and the like was taking off. So they wrapped it up, and that was the end for now. You'd still see a bunch of limited series and stuff. In fact, there's another one this year we'll see called Death, the Time of Your Life, which Gaiman wrote that as well. It was drawn by Chris Bacallo. It's absolutely fantastic. I love that story. Partly because Chris Bacallo's a genius, but also It was a really good story. The New Teen Titans ended with issue number 130. A New Titans book started up as well, so they did some changing of the guard there. And then I guess the other thing is DC worked with Marvel. We had DC versus Marvel books, where you essentially had kind of that, what would happen if Wolverine takes on Batman type of thing, right?
Yeah.
Some of them were done better than others, but that was ran through this year. And then we had another crossover of sorts called Amalgam, which was essentially you would take, what if you had a character who had some of the traits of Spider-Man and some of the traits of Batman? So it was an amalgam of one Marvel character and one DC character. And those were actually a lot of fun. I actually really liked the amalgam books. They were pretty cool. I didn't get all of them, but the ones that I did read, I enjoyed. They were, of course, kind of just in a weird little pocket universe and everything like that. Kind of just a one-time thing, but nonetheless, they were cool. So there's actually a couple of folks from Archie at the Twin Cities Comic-Con this last week. And it reminded me that I don't note it very often, but Archie has actually been soldiering on through all of the 90s. Still doing newsstand distribution, still getting comics out to kids and to people in the world who aren't heading to comic shops. So I salute them here in 1996 for the fact that, again, they continue to do interesting things. They've got the digest formats and everything. They did do one thing. For the first time, evidently, Betty and Reggie started dating, which had evidently never happened before, because, of course, Reggie was always after Veronica. Betty was always after Archie. And then that made Archie and Veronica mad, and evidently it all went back the way it was. But, so anyways, Archie's continuing on through all of this. We have other companies doing their thing. Homage has started. It's a Jim Lee project, basically where he just found creators that he liked and then helped to bring them in to essentially publish them so that they could concentrate on just doing their own thing. So Kurt Busiek's Astro City came in. Terry Moore and his Strangers in Paradise book actually moved and went from black and white to color to Homage. And there was a book called Leave It to Chance by James Robinson and Paul Smith. And Robinson's doing Starman. Paul Smith is the guy who was a fantastic artist on a bunch of X-Men stuff back in the day. They got together and just made this dynamite comic called Leave It to Chance, which I have not reread in too long. And when I was studying for this, I'm like, man, I got to go back and read that again. But it's kind of like a Nancy Drew, only with a bit of actual mysticism, and I think she's got like her own dragon or magical lizard of some sort or something. So it's really good stuff, though. Wildstorm had its own big event called Fire from Heaven that kind of reshaped the Wildstorm universe a little bit. Barry Windsor Smith did his Storyteller books, which I've still never read, but I would love to. They came out in an oversized edition and were evidently really, really interesting. They also, though, because they were in oversized editions and because they were kind of expensive, only lasted like 10 issues and then went away. But according to him, it was something that had been a kind of a passion project of his, to just be able to do comics his own way. And so he did them. And 10 issues later, found out that was not going to work, evidently. So Alan Moore actually rebooted Supreme and kind of that part of the of Jim Liefield's universe entirely. Supreme is basically a Superman analog, and a lot of people say that Moore kind of just felt bad for being a part of that darkening of the comic book landscape with Watchmen and then Killing Joke. And so when he took over Supreme, he basically turned him into essentially like a 1950s, 1960s Superman type of character, where it's a much brighter, happier story. According to most of the reports, it didn't go over very well in the modern dark kind of age. Didn't sell that well, but Liefeld just kept publishing it at a small loss just to see what more would come up with, evidently, for about 20 issues or something like this. And it is interesting stuff.
Oh.
And then outside of that, on the more indie side of stuff, we have something called Berlin, City of Stones that came out from Jason Lutz. Drawn and Quarterly published it. It's actually a sort of like a story set in the late years of the Weimar Republic as Germany is slipping into fascism and ready to be taken over by Hitler. So, kind of a dark story.
That sounds like that would be pretty dark.
Yeah, might be topical to us in the modern age to go back and review where we've gone wrong. But
unfortunately, so I think.
Facts from Sarajevo came out from Joe Kubert, and Kubert had for a long time been a classic cartoonist. You know, he's the guy you think of when you think of Hawkman. He did a bunch of war comics and everything, but he won an Eisner for this. But the reason he did it is a friend of his who was Bosnian or was somehow or another, his family was from that area, had returned to the area of the Bosnian War just before the conflict broke out, and he and his family got trapped there. And so for 2 years, the only way he could communicate with the rest of the world was to send out faxes to friends of his, telling them what they were going through. And Kubert was one of his friends he was faxing, and so he then used those faxes as the basis of the graphic novel to tell this story of what's going on in Bosnia-Herzegovina during the conflict. And pretty dark. But I mean, these are two fantastic, like, pieces of, serious comics, right?
Yeah.
We're getting some of these things every year now where it's definitely not just long underwear types and Archie. There's a lot going on here. We also have Will Eisner doing his graphic storytelling and visual narrative, which is going to become a standard at places like the Kubert School for probably still today, but at least for decades it was. This and then Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud become kind of the two tentpoles of the comic studies, methodologies and the like. And it's, I think, still today really a kind of a groundbreaking thing. We'll also see when we get to the Eisners that he actually won an Eisner for graphic storytelling and visual narrative, which means Eisner actually won an Eisner. And he didn't win some like honorable Eisner or a lifetime achievement or whatever. He won it for something that did not just get it because he was an old guy. This is literally, without any doubt, something deserving of the award, and that, even today is still treasured by a lot of folks. But it's cool that you not only have the award named after you, but you've still got enough talent that you can still come back and win your own award and take it away from the kids even a decade later. So,
sure. Yeah, definitely.
Well done, Will Eisner. Well done.
Yeah.
So
what you've got some notes here about comics on like the big screen and on television here as well, not just the Lois and Clark.
Yep. Yeah. Superman got his own animated series. So Superman got his own animated series. That one is basically similar to the Superman one. It uses a lot of the same kind of almost Art Deco-y kind of styles and the like, but it's just all of the brightness is turned up, and it's still pretty cool stories. Sometimes they remind me a little of the Max Fleischer cartoons from the 40s. I like these. I wouldn't say it's as good as the Batman animated adventures, but that's because nothing is, right? So it actually was a pretty good Superman series. And then we had 3 comic book movies this year. You would be excused for not knowing that, though.
I actually recognize all 3 of the names of these movies. And
Wow.
no, I did not see any of them, to be perfectly honest. And
I,
so it doesn't sound like I missed much then.
I was going to say I'm impressed, but I'm not sure that that would impress me. It would kind of sadden me that you'd actually seen all 3 of these. So, Barbed Wire was actually a relatively high budget movie.
Yes.
Starring Pamela Anderson.
I think that was why. I mean, I was graduating high school in '96, so she was on my radar.
Absolutely. And she was perfect for the part, but it just was not a very good movie. And so that actually lost a lot of money. It was one of the biggest bombs of the 90s, actually, I believe, in terms of the amount of money that it lost. So that's not good. We had The Crow, City of Angels, which was the sequel to the Crow movie, which also flopped. And that actually hurt Fantagraphics, or one of the companies, a bit, because they had some investment in that as well. And then we had The Phantom, starring Billy Zane, which having Billy Zane as your lead is rarely a great sign for your box office, but it also flopped. And so 3 comic book movies from non-DC properties, non-Marvel properties, none of them hit with the general audience at all. And then I guess the last thing just is Love and Rockets, which is a favorite series of mine, ended its initial run at issue number 50 this year, after starting in like 1981. So they made about a 16-year run and then folded up. I think just because they were ready to try some other things. And they've continued to come back to it over and over again. But the main storyline ended here.
So what about sales and industry trends? Were there lots of you had mentioned there was a few companies that were kind of opening up or closing their doors.
Yep.
What were we seeing here for that?
So Acclaim, which had bought Valiant and kind of taken over their stuff, pretty much goes under. They have tons of problems with cash flow. They lose a bunch of money. Technically, I don't believe they actually end this year. They struggle into next year, but they pretty much, 1996 pretty much put the nail in their coffin. They will return later, but under sort of new management. Broadway Comics, Jim Shooter's newest project, also closes again this year. Started last year, it's done this year.
He just can't seem to keep something going now after he leaves Marvel kind of unceremoniously. He just keeps trying problems and can't get it done. Okay.
Yes. And partly, I mean, it's a tough time to make a new comic book universe right now with Marvel and DC doing what they're doing. But
I imagine, yeah.
Nonetheless, he's had a bad few years. We also have problems at Image. Image has cruised along pretty well. Its sales have gone down, but they've diversified. They've gotten a bunch of titles out. They've got really good creators. This is the first year we really see some problems for them. First thing that happens is that Mark Silvestri and his Top Cow Studios actually leave Image. He quits the Image company and stops publishing with the Eye, stops using them as his publisher. Partly because of a feud he ends up in with Rob Liefeld. And a good part of that comes down to the fact that he's got a hotshot artist named Michael Turner, we talked about a while ago. Evidently, Liefeld attempted to poach Michael Turner to bring him over to his studio, which was a significant no-no in the terms of play well together as a bunch of guys who share a studio. Sure. And so Silvestri was angry about that. He left. Later in the year, Liefeld himself actually quits. But he only quits because an emergency meeting of the company has been called for 2 days after that, where the other people involved still were planning on voting him out because they just couldn't work with him anymore. And there's all sorts of lawsuits that get filed on this. Everybody's got their own story. But in general, the allegations against Liefeld range from just base immaturity to sort of theft where he's misappropriating funds from Image and sending them over to his Massive imprint, which is another company he created to publish comics without the Image imprint, and then evidently also used like some of the graphic designers and other people who are hired by Image to do work for his Massive studios, which, because he was one of the leaders and he wrote the checks and things like this, he was able to do. And then, just unfair business practices in general. So he of course said none of this is true, and there was just those guys were out to get him. But however it ends up, you end up with two of the Image founders gone, and sort of that utopian ideal of a happy little studio of artists working together shows its cracks.
Sure.
Stores continue to go under. Many of them are continuing to have all of these problems because of the 3 distributors and all the rest. Some of that gets a little better just because things get worse. So while all of the other stuff is going on, Capital Distribution is actually starting to have all sorts of cash flow problems and ends up actually going under and selling out its warehouses and its distribution to Diamond, meaning that Diamond is now the only comic book distributor outside of Marvel's personal distributor. So you now have only 2 distributors at this point. You've got one for Marvel, and you've got one for everybody else. So it starts to bring about kind of worries about monopolies and things like that. But that's the way it goes. As of right now, nothing happens with that. Outside of that, there are some other interesting things going on, though. One of them is that when I was studying this, I found lots of stories from female creators starting to make their way a little farther into the market. Colleen Duran actually moved Distant Soil up to publish, I think, through Image or someone else. Terry Sue Wood, Jenny Gregory, Linda Medley are getting their books out into more places. Carla Speed McNeil starts a book called Finder. It's a really cool comic book. And just in general, it seems like as everything's crashing around, there still is kind of this space more and more for people with a unique vision to find their way into the market. And part of this does seem to be Sandman, and the fact that Sandman has drawn in a female audience to the comic stores that wasn't there before, which they're then looking for other books while they're there as well.
Sure.
So that's kind of cool. We've got a lot more diversity in some of the stuff that we're seeing. What is left, in other words, on the comic racks in 1996, more and more seems to be non-chaff. By the end of the year, so many things have failed that there is finally a little bit of room for you to see the good stuff. So there's that anyway. We're also starting to see DVD-ROM comics. So we talked about webcomics starting a while ago. I have some of these somewhere, but it was basically you'd buy a DVD and it would have the comic book on it, and you would then like double click and install it.
Okay.
And then you could read the comics on your screen. So
well,
some of them were
fun.
interactive. Yeah. Some of them were interactive. Some of them were almost like Marvel. The Marvel reader has the ability to do panel by panel and stuff. You could do some of that.
Ooh.
And one of them.
I was going to say, what's the sort of price point for something like that at that time? I would imagine it would be it would be relatively expensive.
I think it was like $15-20 to get a collection of books, but it wasn't like one comic or something like that. You would get a few of them on there. Now, I think because like one of them, that I actually put in the notes, is called The Suit, and that was actually written by our man Chichester, which does not surprise me that much considering the whole Tree of Knowledge thing and everything, that he's kind of interested with tech, that he would be one of the people who would do one of these. But I actually would like to track that down. I have never seen The Suit. I did not have that book, so I'm gonna have to see if I can find that. It is interesting, really, how many things I'm seeing that I'm like, man, I would have liked to read that, because 96, I was, picking up a few books here and there, but I was definitely not deep into the hobby. So I missed a lot of stuff, and some of it I've evidently never gone back and found. So my to find and buy and read list just gets longer every week right now.
Sure. So do you want to talk about some of the new companies that started this year, as well as maybe a few companies that saw their end in 1996?
Sure. There's really only two big companies that started. One is Digital Manga Incorporated, which is the comics they put out are under the DMP label, and they are basically mangas. They're going to be not superhero types either. They're mostly going to be slice of life and romance comics. So they kind of have cornered that. They've been going forever. They still now have gone into even current stuff. There's a bunch of different titles they're bringing out. So that's a company that has never ended. And then we have Angel Entertainment, which published 100 series with 138 issues, meaning almost nothing that they did ever had a second issue. But they essentially did sort of like softcore porn comics.
Oh.
So a lot of girl on girl and women in prison comics and bikini comics and that sort of stuff. So I believe they won no Eisners. So
imagine that. Okay, so if that's what's new, were there any big publishers that came to an end this year?
There really weren't. When I look at the names, Starhead Comics would have been sort of an underground type thing. Academy Comics Limited, I don't even know what that is. Newcomers Publishing had 29 series with 70 issues. Roger Corman's Cosmic Comics. The only one really Broadway officially ended. That's the only one we've really talked about any of their books. So again, a really quiet year. Nobody big.
Yeah.
The only one that really has hung around and mattered is in the manga space, and that's DMP. Other than that, the ones that are new and the ones that ended kind of were blips on the radar.
It looks like you have some passings of note for 1996.
Yeah, we're going to start having a bunch of these. But essentially we had Bernard Bailey, who was co-creator of The Spectre and Hourman, the classic Golden Age versions. Jerry Siegel of Siegel and Schuster, the writer who helped create Superman, passed away this year. Obviously, that's one of the giants of the comic industry. Bern Hogarth, who was just a fantastic artist, who did a lot of work on Tarzan and other things. He was a professional illustrator as well as somebody who did book covers, and he did comics. He was a big influence on people like Neil Adams and folks like that. I loved Hogarth's stuff. He also did like a lot of anatomy books and stuff like that, learn to draw books. So a lot of comic book people studied Bern Hogarth. And then we lost two guys who did work for Marvel this year. First off, Mark Grenwald, who we've talked about already.
Yeah, that name's familiar.
He did Squadron Supreme. He had a long run on a bunch of other books in the Marvel Universe. He died at age 43 this year. And then, again, kind of his weird death story is that he is the person who had his ashes put into the printing ink for the graphic novel. And so first editions of Squadron Supreme graphic novel actually were printed with the ashes of Mark Grenwald, the writer of the book, mixed into the printing ink. So they got a special dispensation. His wife shepherded all of that through because it was his wish, and it got done. And then we also lost Jack Abel, who inked the very first Wolverine appearance. So he was one of the people who was on that. He was a long-time inker and artist for DC, working on things like the Legion of Superheroes. He was Kurt Swan's sort of personal inker on Superman for the better part of like 20 years. So somebody who was around the comic industry for a long time. He also actually died eventually of complications of a stroke that was suffered while working at his desk in the Marvel offices.
Wow.
So Didn't quite die on the job, but it was a close thing for him, evidently.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You mentioned the Eisners before. What do the Eisners look like for 1996? Obviously, these would have came out in 1997 for the issues that were
Yep.
published in 1996. You've got a lot of categories here. There's
Yeah.
a lot of award winners. Has the
Mostly.
number of let me
Oh, go
first
ahead.
ask: is there more awards that they're giving out now than they used to?
Oh God, yes. Every year they add a new award.
Okay, I just
It's
because we when we used to have this, it felt like you had listed all of them, and there was like maybe 10 or 12, and now there's a list here, and it goes a page and a half.
up. This is like I think the first Oscars ceremony was like 45 minutes, and now they struggle to get it in
Uh,
under 4 hours. So
yeah.
yeah, this
Okay.
and it gets worse. This is not the final list. Short thing, Tori, to keep it simple. A lot of DC stuff and a lot of stuff that's things we've already talked about. So Starman from that debuted a couple of years ago is winning a bunch of stuff. Astro City continues to win a bunch of stuff. Kingdom Come, very popular, that came out this year. That was the best limited series for the year. Leave It to Chance was considered to be the best new series coming out from Homage. Uh, Best humor publication, and this to give away, I guess, my Marvel pick. My favorite Marvel pick for 1996 is Sergio Aragone's Massacres Marvel. He also did Sergio Aragone's Destroys DC, and those two together won Best Humor Publication.
Okay.
Best Graphic Album was Facts from Sarajevo. Alan Moore won Best Writer for his stuff on Supreme and other things. Mignola won Best Writer Artist. Best Letterer, Todd Klein. I think this may have been his first of like 17. So congratulations, Todd. We'll be sick of you soon enough, but for now, we're happy for you. And other than that, I think most of them are, yeah, kind of some extension of the normal ones we've heard before. Hellboy, Nexus, a lot of Sandman stuff, that sort of thing.
Hall of Fame for this year. It looks like we've got some new entries into the Hall of Fame.
Yep, there's four of them. We've got Gil Kane, obviously, fantastic artist. He did some stuff on Daredevil we've seen.
Yep.
Julia Schwartz, a longtime editor and writer for DC, who was kind of the guy for the Superman universe for a long time. Kurt Swan, who was the longtime penciler for Superman over at DC, and really he was the definitive Superman artist of the 60s, probably even the late 50s and the early 70s. He was just the guy who had the model for Superman. And then lastly, Charles Schultz, not a
Like
not a
Peanuts,
comic
Charles
book guy,
Schultz?
but a cartoon strip guy. Peanuts Charles Schultz goes in. He also got his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame this year.
Oh,
So,
okay. Very nice. Very well deserved. I mean, Peanuts
good
is
year.
like an institution
Yes,
in this.
absolutely.
Before we move on and talk about Marvel, Dan, your pick for favorite comic in 1996 outside of Marvel.
Astro City. I loved Astro City. It's absolutely fantastic. But I have to admit that now, as a hoity-toity comic scholar, I regret that I can't say that it was Facts from Sarajevo or Berlin, because those would have been much cooler answers. Still, Astro City was a good pick. Those are really good books.
There you go. There is Dan's picks for favorite comic outside of Marvel for 1996. I think it's time. We've been putting it off almost 40 minutes here. Oh God, the catastrophe that is Marvel in 1996.
Yeah.
The year in Marvel.
Excelsior!
Okay, here we go. Buckle in, everyone. This is as Dan laid it out in the intro. You said bankruptcy. Is bankruptcy on the table?
Oh, absolutely. But not yet.
Okay.
So 96 starts bad, though, because in 95, they had hemorrhaged a bunch of money. The stock had lost almost 90% of its value. And I think somebody had said something along the lines of it was cheaper to buy Marvel stock than it was to buy Marvel comic book or something like this, right? So
Ouch.
it had lost some value. They were in trouble, but they were still plugging along pretty well in terms of the comic line was still profitable. Even with all the stuff going on, it was making money. And so as things went on, though, things started out rough. They got worse. And over the course of the year, you could see that fans were starting to have their doubts because there were a lot of storylines that just increasingly didn't make sense or weren't interesting. Industry insiders were having a lot of trouble because they were watching Marvel just do things which were not good for the long-term health of the industry. And you also then had the stock market and all of these external forces sort of going, yeah, this is just not going to work, to where there's all these pressures on them. So we had big layoffs in 1995, and then in like February of 1996, they laid off another almost 300 regular staff members. So at that point, they were operating essentially on just this skeleton staff at the office and then bringing in freelancers and people like this to do what they needed to get the books out. But obviously, with cuts last year and 300 people gone this year, you simply do not have the people available to do what you'd done before, right? So because of that, we're going to have a lot fewer books this year. We're going to have a lot less going on. What's interesting is we still have a ton of credits, partly because, as we saw even with Daredevil, there get to be a lot of books that are put together by a bunch of people, just because they don't have folks to do stuff on the regular.
That makes sense. Right, so start us out. Where are we at as far as total series this year?
If you remember a couple of years ago, we were at what, 350, 330?
Yeah,
This year they're at
just over 350, I think, at their height. But there was about 3 or 4 years where they were in that 325 to plus range.
And I think they'd been up to 350 in like 94, and then they went down to 325 or something last year. This year we're at 232 books. So essentially a third of the line less than what they had done last year.
Okay.
So that's pretty substantial. It's still, I mean, really only takes them back to like 1991 or 90, levels. So it's not like they've crashed back to the 60s where they're publishing 8 books or something. But there's a lot less of them than there were.
How about just new series and then the number of series that ended this year?
Yeah, so new series, as far as I can tell, there's 155 new series and 169 ending series. But there are also something like 70 one-shots included in the number.
New.
So when you look at the number of comics that Marvel did this year that actually survive to, go into the future, it's very, very few. In actual fact, the number of series that continue from before 1995 to 1997 is almost nothing. A lot of them do end this year though, and then restart.
Okay.
So for instance, when we look at ending series, Fantastic Four is an ending series this year. Because after 400 and some issues, they canceled it and restarted it. But it's also a starting series this year.
Yeah, okay.
So because of that, there's a lot of them that just sort of, begin and then they'll go for a little while and then they'll end again and stuff like that. But really, it's a near complete destruction of the entire line.
So Daredevil actually is one of the few books that survives this. Our Daredevil does, because we had Daredevil before the main Daredevil run started before 96 and it does continue into 1997. So it is actually one of the few titles that survives this this onslaught, if you will, which actually segues into the year's big event, because that had ramifications throughout the Marvel universe, didn't it?
Onslaught is basically a story that runs through all of the X books, but then affects the whole universe. And essentially, what happens is somehow Xavier or an evil part of Magneto ends up getting absorbed into Xavier's brain. Together, they sort of corrupt and form this weird new entity called Onslaught, although people don't know that's what it is at first. And it comes on as the big bad that starts destroying the entire Marvel Universe. And in the end, it takes all the heroes of the Marvel Universe to defeat them. In the process, like the Fantastic Four end up gone, the Avengers end up gone, large amounts of the sort of the heroes of the Marvel Universe appear to be dead, and the next month they cancel all of these books. So they actually canceled this year, and it's a pretty substantial list. Let me go and just get it here. Fantastic Four, Avengers, Thor, Captain America, Iron Man, Doctor Strange, New Warriors, War Machine, Fantastic Force. It's a pretty impressive list. Fantastic Four, Avengers, Thor, Captain America, Iron Man, and Doctor Strange. So,
Wow.
6 really big books, 5 of which had been going for over 300 issues.
That is crazy.
This is really the first time that the Marvel Universe gets sort of soft rebooted. And the way Marvel reboots is different than the way DC reboots, because they kind of reboot partially, but much of the universe proceeds on, so that technically it's all one story. There's just a big loop in the middle of it, right? But what this ends up doing is basically just messing up everything in the universe. While that's going on, though, there's a bunch of other things happening. First off, you'll notice that the Edge line disappears from Daredevil at some point this year.
Yeah, it did. Towards the end of the year, yeah.
There is no more Edge. They got rid of that subset line and just folded the books back into the regular Marvel Universe. Avengers hit number 400 this year, which it's not 700, but it's pretty good. And it's all Avengers is ever going to get, because it gets canceled with 402 2 months later. So there you go.
Wow.
Congratulations and condolences, Avengers.
Yeah.
Sensational Spider-Man comes in as a new Spider-Man book, taking on or sort of celebrating the idea that Ben Reilly is the new Spider-Man. This is one of the things fans were not happy about at all. And essentially, with Peter Parker being identified as the clone and sent off into, the West, Ben Reilly now becomes the one true Spider-Man. He gets his own book. He's got a slightly different costume that he starts wearing. But fans were not happy with it. And Dan Jurgens had been hired to come on and write Spider-Man, and he was not happy with it. He's like, I didn't come on to write, Ben Reilly. I want to write Spider-Man. I want to write Peter Parker. And the editors also sort of agreed that it didn't really work. So they spent the better part of the year figuring out a way to get rid of the clone and bring back Peter Parker, which they did near the end of the year. So this is the year of Ben Reilly. He starts the year on a high with his own Spider book, and he ends being turned into a puddle of clone goo after sacrificing himself heroically, and Peter taking back over as the real Spider-Man. So we find out that the Green Goblin was responsible, and that in actual fact, Ben Reilly was the clone all along, and Peter Parker's always been the real Spider-Man. But Lee and Liefeld are actually brought back. They negotiate a contract to come back to Marvel, given a lot of control over the characters. Lee takes over Avengers. Liefeld takes over... No. Lee takes over Fantastic Four. Liefeld takes over Avengers. I can't even remember. But they each get a book. They come back. They redo those books. Bring them in. Sales go up. People are pretty happy. But this essentially relaunches the Marvel Universe. So Cap, the FF, the Avengers, Iron Man, All these books canceled. All of them come back in the Heroes Reborn sometime soon. We'll see that coming up. Um, and that then allows them to make some changes and essentially make the characters younger again. So it helps to explain why these characters that have been around for 30 years aren't so old.
Right.
So, Steve Gerber returns and surreptitiously replaces Howard the Duck with a clone in one of the stories that he writes, essentially taking the character he'd created and been fighting over copyrights with for Marvel for decades and tucking him away in a pocket universe so that now the Howard the Duck that remains, at least in his mind, is not actually the real Howard the Duck, and he saved his character from Marvel.
Oh my goodness.
And his editor was not happy when he found out he'd done this because it was kind of crappy thing to do. But in any case, that's Gerber for you. And then with all this, I mean, they'd relaunched. The Onslaught had given them kind of that ability to relaunch the world, and that's how they did the relaunching of all these characters. They canceled all the existing titles. They brought out number ones. As part of this, they got rid of all their licensed books. They got rid of all the books that they were doing that they'd brought over previously from the Malibu universe. So they kind of settled back into a core group of titles. And then, just as the year ended on December 27th, they announced that they were entering Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And everything went kind of up in questions.
Wow.
So we end the year with no real idea. And if you're finishing 1996 as a Marvel employee or a Marvel fan, you have no idea what's going to happen because they've been essentially contracting. They've been firing people. They've been reducing the number of books they put out. But all the while they're doing that, they're still sort of moving the universe ahead and doing interesting things. We're also going to see that as part of this, Bob Harris was actually introduced as the editor-in-chief. He had previously been the editor of the X-Men line of titles when they had their 5 different editors. And they just realized that was unworkable because the editors kept trying to find ways to make money for their books and wouldn't allow crossovers with their characters in others and whatever. So you had basically these companies inside Marvel fighting with each other by doing that. So they got rid of the multiple editors. Bob Harris became the editor-in-chief. Lost almost 300 regular staff members, which is obviously going to hurt a lot. And even while they're doing that, though, you then still end up having almost 694 total employees on staff this year. Or total employees getting credits. So massive numbers of people, most of them folks who are coming over from Liefeld's company or Lee's company or are freelancers. Fewer and fewer of them are Marvel regulars.
So you said the comic book industry part of Marvel was doing okay. Well, why did they end up having to file bankruptcy?
They ended up filing bankruptcy because the guy who purchased the company, essentially probably like 3 or 4 years ago, Ron Perlman, when he originally bought it, because he was sort of like one of those corporate raiders that would go in and raid something for parts and sell it off. When he got there, he was intending to raid the company and use essentially its IP to make movies and then use the comic books as a loss leader. That's what he assumed he'd see. But what he actually found was that the comic books were making a lot of money and it was really hard to sell licensing off to movie theaters and stuff like that, or to movie producers. And so he said, well, let's just make more and more money with the comics then. And that's what he tried to do. And eventually they just sort of overloaded the economy of comic books that way. But while he was doing it, he was using the value of Marvel to leverage the purchase of things like Panini and things like Fleer. And all of these companies that depended on like sports card market stuff, the sports card market just crashed. And all of those were hemorrhaging money. So Marvel lost almost $500 million in the last quarter of 1996.
Wow, that is an unfathomable amount of money.
And I believe that at that point, 7 million of that, so 7/500ths of it, was due to losses on the comic books themselves, on the publishing side of it. And many of those losses probably were incurred partly because of all the terrible cuts and bad decisions that had to be made.
Yeah.
Because, it's because they were doing things like rationing paper clips and stuff at the office at Marvel, which, when you're losing $500 million, why you're worried about the paper clips, I don't really know. But in any case, they've got all of this debt. They've got all this debt service. They've got all these other companies associated to them. And the other problem is that there are actually three rich guys and big egos kind of fighting with each other. And that makes everything even worse. Because you've got Ron Perlman, who's the guy who owns the company. A guy named Carl Icahn, who's another sort of corporate raider investor type, who wants to buy into Marvel, but by doing so, it will weaken Perlman's position, and Perlman's like, no, I don't want to do that. So he refuses that, essentially. Perlman refusing, Icahn misinterprets as there's gold there that Perlman doesn't want me to know about, and that's why he won't take this obviously good deal to save his company. And so he doubles down and then starts to even make more trouble trying to get things. And all the while, you've got Avi Arad and the guys from Toy Biz, which is another company that Marvel had done business with, where they shared stock with them, who are attempting to sort of find their own way into the negotiations and take control of parts of Marvel. And so it's just a bureaucratic disaster at all of the higher levels of management and ownership. And there's a lot of things that Marvel's tied into that have nothing to do with what's going on in Marvel Comics that have nonetheless brought the company low.
That is not a great way to end the year, right after Christmas, announcing bankruptcy and just throwing everything up in the air.
There we go. I should note, there is actually one other thing they did that does involve comics that got them in trouble. And that is, if you remember, a couple of years ago, they acquired that Heroes World Distributing.
Okay.
That continues to go really badly. And so Heroes World makes it more difficult for anybody to get their books. Heroes World is not something they're good at managing, and Heroes World is not a company that's good at distributing comic books. And so that is sort of weighing everything down. And more than weighing it down, it's just putting more money onto the books. Because yet again, they acquired a company they didn't need to, that then just sort of, makes the ship bigger, and there's more mouths to feed and no profits to pay any of this off. So, yeah, between the trading card companies and the distributors and the billionaires, everything's a disaster.
So, you talked about the fact that a lot of the major titles got canceled. Well, and some of them got restarted right away this year as well. What are some of the standouts as far as new series that will continue into 1997?
So most of the new titles, the new Captain America, the new Avengers, they're going to go 13 issues. So Avengers, Captain America, Fantastic Four, all go 13 issues. Iron Man, I think, goes a little longer than that, but maybe not. In any case, they're going to stick around for a year, and then something else is going to happen. We also see some other books that are interesting. The new Elektra series comes out this year, and that's actually pretty good. There's another Adventures of Spider-Man, and Adventures of the X-Men, kind of another younger type series. Again, we had Sensational Spider-Man, that lasted 30-some issues. There were a bunch of Star Treks that came out. They relicensed into that after getting rid of a lot of their other stuff. And then a few Uncanny books that lasted a little while. Some Uncanny Origins, Professor Xavier, well, I guess, that's the Marvel fanfare stuff. And then a few others. So really, mostly the books that are going to matter this year are going to be those relaunches, and then Elektra, I think, is the other really big one. The Star Trek ones last a little while, but not that long.
What about on the limited side? Is there any standout books on the limited side?
Is it okay if I say no? I have read most of these, and I did not love them, to be quite frank. This was a rough year for quality, I will admit. A lot of the stuff this year was... It seemed rushed. It seemed like it didn't have a lot of real heart behind it. I'm going to say that actually Daredevil is probably one of the best Marvel titles of this year. And you're going to probably tell me, but I hated Daredevil this year. How can that possibly be?
There was an interesting story for Daredevil this year that we'll get to. Well, the thing I'm noticing when I'm looking at the limited series, it is like these aren't one shots, but previously it felt like most of the limited series were going 6, 8, 10, maybe 12 issues. Almost all of these that you have listed here are 2 issues to 4 issues.
It's a really good observation. Yeah, that's true. And some of those are going to be reprints, and others are just shorter. The other thing, when you were talking about it, they're really doubling down on Spider-Man and Venom and X-Men and X titles. Mystique.
The known good properties, right?
Mystique, Magneto, X-Men, and the Brood, X-Men Clandestine, Wolverine stuff, Pride and Wisdom. So just tons of mutant books here. So they really are kind of hunkering down into the stuff that has proven to sell.
So this can't bode well for new characters this year. If we're
I've
canceling...
put the list of new characters in there. Do you know any of these people?
No, actually, and I've got almost 300, 275 characters in Marvel Snap now, and even from that standpoint, I don't recognize really any of these names.
No, as far as I can tell, there was not a single useful character created in Marvel in 1996 that lasted. The ones that are on sort of the list that I look at a lot of times, Delilah Dearborn, Scott Washington, who is Hyber, Rebecca Ricky Barnes, and Susanna Sherman. So, I mean, Geiger we do see every once in a while. She is a character who's got a little bit of time in the Marvel universe, but really it's rough. It's a rough year, and I don't think there's anybody created this year that matters. I find that crazy to say, but that wasn't what they were concentrating on this year either.
That actually tracks based on what we've seen and what we've talked about to this point. This entirely tracks to me.
Oh.
So you mentioned Malibu titles canceled, licensed content. A lot of that outside of Star Trek seems to be canceled as well.
No.
The big 5 that you mentioned: Fantastic Four, Avengers, Thor, Captain America, Iron Man, all over 300 issues, all ending as part of this soft reboot with the Onslaught saga. Is there any other books that you want to note that ended this year outside of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, New Warriors had gone 75 issues. That ends now. Barbie and Ren and Stimpy and Beavis and Butthead all end. So some of their more popular licensed stuff.
Yeah.
Spider-Man 2099, Doom 2099, X-Men 29, and Ghost Rider 2099. They canceled the entire line, so those all just ended. Prime, Ultra Force, a number of the others, Mantra, Ruin, that was some of the stuff that would have been the Malibu books. But it was just a real a real mess. Lots of books that had been on for a while that just disappeared.
This is a bloodbath right here. This is I can honestly tell you I never thought I would see something like this. But it, as you say, desperate times, it seems, called for desperate measures, and that's what had to happen, I guess.
Well, and when you look at Marvel thriving now, it would be easy to think it's always just been kind of this slight upward kind of trajectory.
That's I guess where my head was.
You hit the 90s and suddenly we've got this big trough for about 5-6 years, and it's kind of weird. So now will be the time where it just gets a little bit uglier year after year for a little bit. So
let's talk about the bullpen. You mentioned a total number of employees.
Yep. About 700 people got credits. About 250 of them are new. About 300 of them got fired at some point in the year. So about 300 of the people who have credits did not actually end the year with the company. As far as Rookie of the Year, we could probably just go into that. Oh,
who you mentioned editor-in-chief. Now we have one, right?
Yep. Bob Harris is the editor-in-chief right now. He'll be there until 2000, so he's got 5 years.
Let's jump in and let's talk about then the Rookie of the Year. Who were the in consideration for this year before we get to the win?
So there actually were a lot of folks, but I'm not going to try and list too many. So I actually limited myself to 2 people I want to mention. Greg Land has actually been doing a lot of stuff for Marvel for a long time. There's probably a lot of Marvel Snap characters that have Greg Land artwork on them, I would suspect, because he's done covers, he's done posters. He also, although he's done some Fantastic Four and X-Men interiors, he does have an asterisk by him, as some folks do, because for a long time he has not only admitted that he's used hardcore pornography as reference for a lot of his stuff, but many people say that he uses the reference just too much, to the point where he isn't really drawing a lot of his stuff. He's just using things out of magazines or even, adult films as the way that he gets his photo references. So there are a lot of especially female characters he draws that are in very odd sort of poses that once you know the background behind it, you're like, hold on, that's a little weird. But he is a really cool artist. He does do great stuff in terms of a lot of the covers he does and things like that. I don't know I'd want to put him at the top, considering some of our other folks. We've also got Michael Aldred I want to mention. He did Ecstatic and a few other things for Marvel. He's actually better known for Mad Men, and then also for iZombie, which was turned into a TV show a few years ago.
I recognize that name for a TV show.
Yeah. So Aldred's somebody I really like.
But I like the choice of the winner this week. This is an artist that I like quite a bit, specifically from his run in Moon Knight, but I've seen Wolverine and some things that he's done. I have some of his art.
I figured that you might actually like David Finch as our choice, so I weighed that in as well. Look, there's nobody who really is like a Stan Lee or Jack Kirby type that started at this point. Almost everybody now is going to do a little time at Marvel and then go off and do awesome things other places. So as far as finding somebody who's got like 100 issues on a book or whatever, it's tough. None of these guys have a really brilliant Marvel sort of catalog. But Finch has done some pretty fantastic stuff for Marvel. He did the Moon Knight run, he did New Avengers, he's done a bunch of covers, he continues to do a bunch of covers. And I think his art is really sort of something that is perfect for the late 90s and early 2000s at Marvel. So he helps define a time.
That definitely tracks. That was something I was thinking about as you were leading into why he was picked. There is, the guys are absolutely massive and huge, and they're just some of the action sequences are brutal in their detail, and there's a lifelikeness to his art that I've really like, sometimes to a bit of a fault, because it does become quite
Yes.
quite grotesque at times as well. So
Yeah, it gets a little bit overboard, but that also is partly just, unfortunately, if you take a really good artist and you put them on Moon Knight, it can be a little bit gross because Moon Knight does some kind of disgusting things occasionally. So, and in that Charlie Houston storyline, especially, Houston is a relatively graphic writer. He was in his novels, and he also is in other stuff. So, yeah, it was a little crazy, but he's just a fantastic artist. Has done a lot of stuff. I think he's a good pick. Somebody that
still
makes a perfectly decent rookie of the year.
still doing stuff for Marvel. He
Oh
came
god,
back
yeah.
to Moon Knight recently. Did a cover for the first issue of the kind of in between the post first Jed McKay run and now the new Moon Knight Jed McKay
Yep.
run that is going now. That that was really cool looking and reminded me of just how awesome David Finch can draw Moon Knight.
Well, that's the other thing, is that a lot of the people we'll be talking about now going forward are going to be in their late 40s, early 50s, so they've still got an awful lot of comics left to do. So, obviously, 20 years from now, we could look back and Mike Allred has had like the most impressive run on Fantastic Four in the history of the character, and I'm going to look pretty dumb on this, but as of now, in the winter of 2024, this would be my pick.
All right, let's wrap it up for this week. Dan, what was your favorite Marvel comic for 1996?
Said it earlier, Sergio Aragones Massacres Marvel. It's the brilliance of Aragones, and just, I think, as much as anything, it's just kind of a meme pick for this year, because it was, Marvel pretty much was like Gru went through The Office this year and just hacked everything to pieces, and it's going to get worse. I mean, the other weird thing is 1996 is when we get to the bankruptcy, but it's going to resolve itself now over the next couple of years. Nothing's actually happened yet because they only announced it 4 days before the end of the year.
Right. You don't just announce bankruptcy and poof, everything is fixed. There
Yep.
is some work that has to be done to get you back
Yep.
into the green and that sort of thing. So things actually can get worse before they get better from this point even.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But we have for next week we've got Daredevil and the year that Daredevil had, which was actually, I think, a pretty good year. We had Foggy finding out at the end of 1995 that Matt Murdock, his buddy, longtime buddy since college, was in fact the Scarlet Swashbuckler, the Hornhead, if you will, that he's interacted with a bunch of times, and that ends up being kind of important as we move forward here.
Still can't believe that he didn't know. Like, just how
Yeah.
clueless are you, Mr. Nelson? But
Well,
he definitely did take it hard. So
yes, he definitely lets us know that he's not too happy about being left in the dark as we start out the year. But that is for next week. For now, that wraps us up for this week. We'd like to thank you all for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help other new listeners find the show that much easier. Now, whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts on this week's show. You can send us those comments via email. That address is comments@comicsovertime.com, or you can reach out to us via X or Blue Sky. Both places, we are at Comics Over Time. Dan, this was an enlightening discussion about the comic book industry in 1996. Oh, God, I can't even imagine what 1997 is going to look like, but we got to wait a couple weeks for that. We got Daredevil next week.
absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Until next week, take care, everybody.
See you later, folks.